Minolta SR2 was Minolta's first single-lens reflex camera, launched in 1958, that established the basis for Minolta's dominance in the consumer-oriented camera market of the 1960s. I'm Laszlo Vesco, and on my channels I've been tracing the story of cameras in action, starting with roll film cameras from the 1890s through each decade. So we've been exploring the 1950s, including the single lens reflex cameras that really started to flood the market in the late 50s. Recently I've reviewed the Voigtlander Best-O-Matic, and today we're going to look at the Minolta SR series, Minolta's first series of single lens reflex cameras that launched with the SR2 in 1958. But before we get to that, let's take a look at how I actually got to this point of collecting these cameras and using Minoltas. Going backwards and starting with the Minolta X700, which was my very first camera that I received new for Christmas in the 7th grade. So the X700, which launched in the early 80s, was Minolta's best and final flagship manual focus camera of the 1980s. And I was super excited to shoot with this, and I was very proud to have a camera with all these bells and whistles, and initially very excited that it had not just aperture priority programming, but program priority programming, ways to adjust the exposure compensation. But as I got better in photography, I started to be curious about what preceded it. Photographers have an affinity for their gear. I mean, cameras are with you all the time. They're there on your adventures, on your trips, on your family events. You get to know and use your camera very closely. So it's natural, even today with digital cameras, for people to develop an affinity for their particular camera brand that they shoot with. And that was the case for me. So I started to be curious about what preceded the X700. What came before? And one of the practical reasons was I wanted to add a second camera body to be able to use with my gear. So I got the Minolta XG1, which was a more consumer-oriented version from the late 70s. But then, I continued to be curious about what preceded that. And in high school, if I remember right, I got the Minolta SRT 101, learning about Minolta's SRT series from the late 60s, and started to shoot with this. And in parallel, the curiosity about vintage camera, I basically developed a passion for vintage cameras and started collecting cameras of all sorts of different brands. But tracing back, getting back to today's focus, and tracing back the evolution, or going backwards, the devolution of Minolta's line of manual focus cameras. So we had the X series, or the X700 and the X series of the 80s. Going back, let's see, what do we have here? With the XD series, I have the XK, or X1 as it was known in Japan. And of course the SRT 102, or Super as it was called in Japan, the 101. And prior to it, of course, the SR series. And today in my hand, I have the SR3 camera as well as the SR1. Might be disappointed that I do not actually have an SR2. So here's a picture of that. But as you will see, it is more or less identical to this SR3. The SR2 was launched in '58, and it was quickly followed by the SR1, which was a simpler version. You might be wondering about Minolta's choice of numbering and why they would launch the 2 before the 1. And the reason for that is, which is often the case today as well, you want to come out with your top-end model first. And Minolta at the time in 50s and 60s had an affinity for the number 2. So, they launched their top model, the SR2 first, and followed by the SR1. The SR1 being a slightly simpler camera with a top speed of f 1/500th of a second instead of the SR2's 1/1000th of a second. But other than that, they were pretty identical. And then they also wanted to upgrade and include the ability to have an exposure meter added on, and launched the SR3 in 1960. So these sort of came out very quickly within of each other. The SR3, for of how it looks, other than the ability to clip on a meter, was identical to the SR2. And I simply, the SR2 is obviously more collectible. They didn't really make that in that high of a number, as they quickly moved on to the SR1 and SR3, and hence it has a little bit of a premium price-wise. And I simply haven't been able to find or obtain one. And then I kind of give up. I mean, how many different SR series cameras do I really need? Let's take a look at these early cameras. These featured, as I mentioned, a sort of a contemporary way of setting your self timer. It had just a automatically resetting exposure counter, ability to open your film back by pulling up on the rewind lever, and shutter speeds from 1 to 1,000, a contemporary bayonet mount. Unlike some other manufacturers of the era that started with one mount and then needed to change it as they evolved it later on, the SR mount was really well designed and lasted through all the way into the entire length of Minolta's manual focus SLRs. So every single lens ever made for an SR series camera can mount on one of the later cameras as well. And these initially featured, as I've mentioned, the automatic aperture close down. And by the way, some of the very early lenses didn't have that aperture close down, so you had to close them down manually. And those were the simple SR lenses. There really isn't many of those, and I don't have one. I think that was the 100mm and 135mm, if I recall correctly, because even when the SR2 launched, with its 55mm f1.8 lens, that was automatically an auto aperture lens, and you can tell these by the fact that they're called auto rockor being Minolta's line of lenses that they manufactured. So most of the lenses already starting to come out were auto rockor lenses, meaning they had automatic aperture close down. And then later on, as the series evolved, they started to move into the meter coupled lenses, like the one I have here on this SR2 SRT Super. These meter coupled or MC series allowed for the in-camera through the lens metering that came out with the SRT series of cameras, and of course finally ending up with the MD series that allowed for program for the camera itself to set your aperture with program exposure control. And by the way, if we take a look at these older lenses, I do enjoy how their design. They featured a flat matte finish, and just they have that vintage vibe to them, and it progressively got more and more contemporary as it moved on, ending up with the lenses that are the MD series that had a lot of plastic to reduce weight, etc. So in terms of style, I do have to say I admire the older it is, the better it looks, in my opinion, especially since they were all black initially. So the aperture ring being all black and the lens being all black. Later on with the MC series, a simple way to determine them is that they started to have these silver aperture rings. But so again, my opinion, these older auto rockor lenses are just, they look vintage. So, and I'll have to create a video reviewing these lenses and the lens quality in more detail. Minolta is known. They advertised in the 1960s that they were only one of two, together with Nikon. They were the only two camera manufacturers that actually ground and created and melted down and created their own optical glass. The others at that time in the 60s, Canon, Pentax, etc., they would just obtain third-party sourced optical glass. I don't think that makes any difference, by the way, but Minolta was known for their excellence in their glass. One of the unique things that they also strove for early on is that they had excellent coatings. Very early on, they had multi-coated lenses, and they aimed to balance their coatings across their lenses, which was also a little bit of unique to them from a color cast perspective. So Minolta lenses will give you the same color cast regardless of which lens you put on, which wasn't quite the case with other manufacturers that simply optimized the coatings for each individual lens, and one of them might be warmer, one of them might be cooler, and that was not the case. So Minolta took big pride in their lenses, and indeed lenses are critical because the SR 1, 2, 3 cameras or the X700 camera will take the same exact picture. And that's sort of the neat thing with film cameras. It's the lens that matters. Otherwise, you just need a reliable shutter so that it doesn't screw up the exposure. But other than that, all these fancy bodies with the additional bells and whistles for exposure metering, etc. These days, I just use my iPhone app. It works great to figure out the exposure, or oftentimes if it's nice and sunny, and I usually shoot outside anyway, just use the sunny 16 rule. And this Minolta SR1 or SR3 without any exposure meters built in takes just as good images with the same glass as the latest from the 80s. So let's move on to this SR1. Now, the SR1 I have here is the SR1S. This was a slightly later evolution. It was actually the last evolution of the SR1 because Minolta continued to improve these lines. As you could see, the styling of the body now is more streamlined, simplified compared to the SR3. The SR3, along with the SR2, and the first version of the SR1, by the way, had this sort of stepped design for their top plate, for example, and it's simply more vintage looking from today's perspective, whereas this SR1 now adopted or used the same sort of styling the SRT series had, which was cleaner, more streamlined. So this isn't obviously from the 50s, and I'm reviewing it part of the 50s, so apologies for that, but this was the one I shot with, and I'm going to be sharing some of the images that I've got from it. So this is the Minolta SR1S, which also now featured a 1/1000th of a second instead of the 1/500, but this was their basic camera of the era. And the other addition that this also featured that the first versions didn't is that it has a mirror lockup on the side, similar to the SRT series. You can argue is an SRT camera without built-in exposure metering. The SR1 and SR3 feature these clip-on meters. So this particular one is a CDS meter. You can see that it's not the big selenium cell. And so this is the third version. They had another CDS version that was the second meter, and then the first one, which was a selenium meter that coupled onto these pronged base with two holes in a prong, whereas this one slides on to a different type of holder. And so what you would do is, let's see, it's on X60th, set that roughly there. As you slide this on, kind of just wiggle it around, then it couples to the dial, and you turn it on, and this works, and then you read off the aperture that you need to set. So it's pretty neat. So you've got that to work with, and of course, it's just pretty cool to shoot with this contraption compared to the integrated ones. But even without that, as I mentioned, just use your iPhone app and shoot with it. So it's going to be just as easy to use and takes just as good images. And that's about it. I mean, what's again remarkable with these very first SR series cameras is just how contemporary they were. And this is what led to the success of Minolta becoming, in the 60s, one of the most successful camera manufacturers, certainly for SLR cameras. They weren't aimed at professionals. That was the Nikon F series, but perhaps together with Pentax, who were also, Pentax and Minolta were the largest manufacturers basically in the 60s for single lens reflex cameras. And so it's great to pick one of these up, whether or not you collect Minolta cameras. Of course, they're all mechanical. You may opt for the ones with the through the lens light meters, the SRT series, perhaps. But I do find the very simpler, clean design of this SR1 in particular. So let's take a look at some of these images. These were all shot with this 28mm f3.5 auto record lens. So as you could see, that this was back in the winter on a trip to Skytop, Pennsylvania, and some of the hiking with it along a stream there. And as you could see, yeah, these are, I think they're not super critically sharp per se, but they have a nice rendering. They control flare pretty well, so these were already by then multi-coated from Minolta, but of course their coatings improved over time. So to wrap up the SR series, just final comments about whether or not you may want to own one of these. So on one hand, one of the benefits is that you get a camera from the 50s or early 60s, all mechanical, reliable. They handle really well. They have a nice winder, shutter, etc. On the downside, the fact that they were so contemporary and forward-looking is that it doesn't really feel much different. So certainly it doesn't feel any different than the SRT series, or even, once you start moving into their electronic shutter, camera systems, of course, now you're getting into somewhat a different feel, but you can't mistake it to be a Minolta. And that is sort of true for other brands as well. I think these manufacturers established their styling design early on. So if you want to have variety, you actually have to jump around and get different brands of cameras. And that's one of the reasons I enjoyed getting the Canon Flex cameras, is that they feel different than the Minolta cameras I'm used to. And of course the Voigtlander feels very different. But long story short, they were great cameras, and the SR series started a long line of successful cameras for Minolta. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe to follow along. I'll be next reviewing the Canon Flex SLRs, and then also reviewing some of the rangefinder system cameras of the 1950s before moving on to the 1960s. Thanks very much, and see you soon.